Okay, so ensuring that we know who our users are that are connecting to our sockets is actually going to look pretty similar to what we did with our middleware for our routes. So the first thing that we're going to need to do here, though, is inside our note detail page, when the user wants to connect to our server, right, via a WebSocket, we're going to want to have our client side include their auth token along with this request. So what we're going to do here, we're going to actually include that token in this query, right? This query data that we're sending along to the socket. And what that's going to look like, we're going to have to do something like this and get the user. Oops, here, let me just rethink the indentation here a little bit. All right, so we're going to have the auth token here. So we'll say token, and then we're going to need to get the auth token of the user. So what we're going to have to do is use this use user hook that we had from before, and basically we're just going to have to call the correct method on this user that we get back. So let's go back to our note detail page here, and what we're going to do first of all is add the use user hook to our component. So we'll say import use user from hooks use user, and then down here we're going to say const is loading, which we're going to have to rename to is loading user since we already have an is loading variable in here. And we're going to have the user themselves, and we'll say equals use user here. All right, so we have is loading user and user. So let's go down to our use effect hook here where we're establishing this connection. We're going to want to make sure that this doesn't happen, right? That we don't try and establish this connection until the user is actually created. So, well, first of all, let's say token await user.getID token. All right, and since we just used await, we're going to have to wrap this entire thing inside of an async function. So we'll say const, and we'll say connect to socket. That's going to be an async function, and we're going to put all of this logic inside of here. So let's take all of this, except for the return socket.disconnect, of course. So we'll leave that here, and there we go. Okay, so now that we have this set up here, this connect to socket thing set up, we're going to have to call that, but we only want to call it conditionally, right? Because we only want to call it, of course, if the user is loaded and exists. So what we're going to do is say if not is loading and user, then what we'll do is call this function. So we'll just say connect to socket. All right, and then of course we're going to have to add is loading and user to our dependency array here for our use effect hook. And that should be all we need to do there. So this should include the user's ID token with the connection request that our client side is making to the server. So on the server side, what this is going to look like, we're going to have to open up server.js. And just like how we've seen earlier, that with an Express server, you can say app.use and pass some middleware like this, right? Request, response, and next, with next being a callback that you can call to transfer control over to whatever the next piece of logic is, right? A route handler or something like that. Just like we were able to do that with Express, we can also do that with IO, right? So we can say io.use, and what this will be here is a callback that will take the socket that's connecting as an argument, right? So we'll say socket, and also a next function, just like in Express, that we can call to transfer control over to whatever the next handler is, right? So this is going to be called before we get to this connection callback here. Now, what we can use this for is, again, pretty much the same thing that we used it for with Express. We're going to use it to get the ID token that was included with the request and load the corresponding user and just make sure that they're allowed to do what they're trying to do. So what this is going to look like, the first thing we're going to do is check to make sure that a token property was included with this request. And the way that we get that is by saying socket.handshake.query.token. Okay, so that's going to be equal to, if we go back to our note detail page here, that's going to be equal to this token property here, right? So basically the stuff that we include in here is on socket.handshake. All right. So the way that we're going to make sure that that exists is we're going to say if it doesn't exist, right? So we'll say if socket.handshake.query doesn't exist or socket.handshake socket.query.token doesn't exist, then what we're going to do is we're going to send back an error event to the client. Now, with Express, this was done by sending back a response with a certain status code. On socket.io, this is done by emitting an error event. So we're going to say socket.emit error, and the extra information that we're going to include with this event will just be a message saying something like, you need to include an auth token. All right, not that this will happen if everything works well on our front end, but it just, just in the off chance that it does happen, that message will be helpful. So cool, that should protect the rest of our socket logic from users who haven't included that. Oh, one thing we are going to want to do here is say return socket.emit so that none of the logic after this will get called. And what we're going to do next is we're going to actually verify the ID token. So we'll say const user equals await admin.auth.verify ID token. Oops, let's try that again here. .verify ID token, there we go. And we're going to pass that token that we got from the client side. So we'll say socket.handshake.query.token, and we know that exists already because of this logic up here. And one more thing we're going to have to do with this await, we're going to have to add async to this callback. So there we go. And once we have our user, what we're going to do, again, this is a lot like what we did in Express, where we said request.user equals user. But in socket.io, we say socket.user equals user. All right. And another thing that we might want to check for too, we're probably going to want to surround this in a try-catch block in case this verify ID token thing fails. We'll do that in just a second. But what we're going to do is if we got the user and after we set it on the socket, we're going to call the next callback there. Okay? Cool. So let's wrap this in a try-catch block, like I said, in case the user's ID token doesn't verify, right? In case it doesn't check out. So what we're going to do in that case is we're just going to say socket.emit. We're going to send back an error, and we'll say invalid auth token. Cool, so that should at least allow us to know who the user is and make sure that they actually have a valid ID token before allowing them to connect, which is obviously a good thing. So now that we have all of that, what we're going to need to do is down here in format shared note, remember that this function actually takes a note and a user because it has to actually find out what the user's relationship is to the note, whether they can edit it or not. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say format shared note, and we can now access the user by saying socket.user. All right, that's the socket.user that we set up here in io.use. All right, so let's give this thing a try. We're going to have to run this now. If it isn't already running for you, I'm just going to restart it to make sure that everything's working correctly. All right, so our server's listening, and let's see if this all works. And it looks like this socket.disconnect thing isn't working anymore because it's not in the same scope after adding the asynchronous function in our note detail page. So what we're going to do for that is we're actually going to move that into its own useEffect hook. That will just listen for changes to the socket. So we'll just say socket, and it'll look like that. And we'll just say if socket, then we want to return something that will disconnect that socket. So that should take care of disconnecting from our socket when this thing is unmounted. Awesome, so let's go back here now, and everything should work like we want it to. We see that we have this edit thing on there now. All right, so let's try making some changes from here, and what we're gonna see is that if we add some things from this window, those changes will show up immediately in this other window. Now, something I would not recommend doing is having both of these things editing at the same time. That actually is going to require some pretty complex logic to deal with. So for the time being, we're just going to assume that only one user is editing at a time. And yeah, that's not quite as much fun, but for the time being, that's just what we're going to do because it'll allow us to get some more experience with WebSocket without having to get into the nitty-gritty details of having two or more clients interact with their data. So cool, this looks like it works. One thing though that you're going to see is that after editing a note, this edit button disappears. And the reason for that is simply because we need to format the note when we're returning the note from our server here, right? So when we're saying note updated, we need to format the note there as well. So for that, we can just say format shared note, updated note, and we're going to say socket.user in there as well. All right, now there is one thing that's actually wrong with this, and in order to see what that is, we're going to go over to our application and we're going to click on Edit. So right away when we click on Edit, you're going to see that even though we're trying to format that thing correctly, the Edit button still disappeared. Now the reason for this is a little bit tricky to wrap your head around perhaps if you're still new to Socket.io, but let's think about what we're doing here, right? What we're doing when we say io.emit is sending the same event to all of the currently connected sockets. So our first inclination with this format shared note thing might have been that each specific client would have gotten the note formatted exactly for them, right? However, this socket.user here is referring to the user that updated the note in the first place, and not to the specific user that we're sending this event to, okay? So that's the tricky part, right? Because at the moment where we want to send different events with different data to all of the users, right? Because all of the users that are connected are potentially going to have different permissions. At that point, we're going to have to actually send different events completely to each of those clients. Now, in order to send a different event to each and every connected socket, here's what we're going to have to do. Instead of saying io.emit, we're going to have to actually get all of the currently connected sockets from this IO object and loop through them, sending a specific event to each of those sockets. So here's what that's going to look like. I'm just going to put this down here for now. We're going to say IO, and here's the really strange part. We need to say .sockets. I honestly have no idea why they decided to do it this way, but basically in order to get sockets as an array, which we want to do because we want to do for each here, in order to get sockets as an array, we have to do .sockets. Again, I think that's a little bit silly, but that's the way it is. So anyway, we now have an array of sockets that we can loop through, and these are all of the connected sockets. So the way that we can use this to send a different event to each socket is going to be to simply say, for each, and then we'll just call this something like user socket, or we'll call it target socket, I suppose. For each target socket, what we're going to do is we're going to emit the same event. So we're going to say target socket.emit. And instead of saying socket.user here, we're going to say target socket.user. All right, so that will get the user for that specific socket instead of the user that triggered this update note thing here. All right, again, this is a little bit confusing, and I'm going to be completely honest here. This took me a good long time to figure out what was going wrong with this. So anyway, what we have here should now work, right? We should be sending an accurate event with accurate data to each client whenever an update note action occurs. So let's try this out again. We're going to go back to our application, and just to make sure, let's just refresh here. And now what we're going to see is when we click on edit, the edit button here stays. So in other words, this client here is getting back the correct formatted note and not the formatted note that was formatted for this user over here. All right, and of course, just to test this out, let's delete some of this here. And there we go. So everything seems to be working on that front. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.